Hey there! So I think that we're live. But I never completely believe it until I actually see a few comments in my little comments box over here. But I do see 2 thumbs ups. Maybe that means that some of you are already here. But anyway, hi, welcome. And I'm Marta, and this is Divergent Design Studios, and this is my very second live stream. My intention is to do this once a week on Thursdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, although already life got in the way last week and I had to cancel last week's, but I'm hoping to be as consistent as possible here on out. And I probably should have like a little pithy tagline about what Divergent Design Studios is. Oh, here's somebody. Shahida, I think, is how you would say it. Welcome. I'm so happy to have you here, Shahida. Really glad to see you. Anyway, yeah, I think I should probably have a little pithy tagline about what Divergent Design Studios is, but I haven't gotten that far yet. This is very much a work in progress. But I guess I could say that in a nutshell, Divergent Design Studios is all about, supporting neurodivergent people. And by neurodivergent, I mean ADHD, autistic, and other non-normative neurotypes. Supporting neurodivergent folks to disrupt shame and start to think like designers so that we can build consistently satisfying creative practices and design lives that actually work on our own terms for us. So that's sort of the gist of what Divergent Design Studios is all about. And this live stream is all about just sort of addressing some of the issues, the really wide-ranging issues that are involved with living healthy, meaningful, neurodivergent lives. So anyway, a few more people here. I'm really happy to see everyone. This at least means that I'm not just talking into a camera and nobody is on the other end. It's always a little bit disconcerting. But anyway, so last time, week before last, I did my very first live stream, and it was all about looking at the differences between executive function as a paradigm for how to sort of think and be and work in the world, and contrasting that with the paradigm of design thinking. I'm a believer that neurodivergent people, generally speaking, are better designers than we are executives, but that we live in a world that expects us to be executives. And so there's all kinds of problems that result from that because we're just not very good at being executives. And we're also not really well supported in being designers because that's not really how this world works so well. So I'm going to take a quick sip of water. So yeah, that video, which I can, for people who are watching this on a replay, I can link to, but you can also just find it. That video got me thinking a lot because one of the things I've been talking about executive function mostly over on Instagram until just recently, but I've been talking a lot about executive function for a long time and really sort of taking a critical lens to what it is that we mean by executive function and why we think that executive function is so important in the world and why we stigmatize neurodivergent people for not being very good at it. And I've been thinking about this for a very long time and doing a fair amount of research about it. And one of the interesting things that I have discovered in my research is that in the world of neuroscience, anyway, the whole notion that there is such a thing as executive function and that it resides, that it is a specific set of skills or higher order thinking, and that it resides in a specific place in one's brain. is not at all settled science among neuroscientists, which was really startling to me because if you look at the way it's spoken about in the mainstream sort of, sort of science journalism and mental health circles, and certainly among neurodivergent people and the people who sort of support them, you would think that this was as settled as the fact that, human beings have hearts that beat, but it's not at all. And so that sort of set me off on this critical path to question what is exactly is executive function, and what do we mean by it, and does it even exist at all? And a lot of the feedback that I would get from people when I started talking about it in these critical ways was, yeah, well, that's all well and good, but my life is still so disrupted by executive dysfunction, and it makes me miserable, and I can't function in the world on account of my executive dysfunction. And so I've had to sort of not backpedal exactly, but I've had to sort of offer this caveat that I am not in any way trying to make light of the ways that what we call executive dysfunction disrupts our lives. And that's sort of what I want to talk a little bit about today. I'm not even so much conceding that executive function as those in like the ADHD industry and the educational industrial complex talk about it really exists. But I am very clear from my own life, from the lives of people that I love, and the lives of lots of people in my audience and my community, that what we refer to as executive dysfunction really does exist, and is in fact disabling to us. So that's sort of what I want to talk about today. But first I need to back up a tiny bit, because I think that there are two ways to talk about executive function. When we talk about it in the community, in the sort of neurodivergent community, when we say things like, oh, I'm having a really bad executive function day, or my executive dysfunction is really acting up, when we say those kinds of things, usually what we're talking about is a very discrete set of skills that we're not very good at. So things like remembering where we put our keys, or getting things on our calendar accurately and then remembering to show up for appointments, being really messy and disorganized in our lives, and keeping our houses tidy, and even things like being able to feed ourselves effectively and like at the right frequency and in the right sort of nutritional ways that our bodies need. Like, those are the set of discrete skills that we talk about as executive functioning skills within the neurodivergent community. Outside of sort of the mainstream way that we talk about it, the theorists of executive function, and I'm talking specifically about Russell Barkley, whose work I have read most extensively on executive function, they're really talking about something else. They often refer to executive function as a set of higher order thinking skills. And specifically what they mean is the ability to set a goal, a very specific and concrete goal, sometime in the future. And usually that goal is about being independent and self-sufficient and functioning well in a capitalist society. So in this formulation, executive function is the ability to set such a goal and then to move toward it in a single-minded, focused, undistracted, and ultimately successful way. So to get as quickly from A to B being independence, self-sufficiency, productivity, etc., etc. That's what people like Russell Barkley mean when they say that executive function is higher order thinking. And my hold on one second. Yeah? All right, never mind. I'm sorry. I thought that my husband was calling to me. Yeah, never mind. Sorry about that. This is the problem of having two people working at home, like with just one wall separating us. All right, so this notion that executive function is a higher order thinking that neurodivergent people sort of lack or that we're bad at is something that I am very critical of and that I want to debunk. I believe that no matter how you're thinking about executive function or how you define it, whether it's that set of skills or whether it's this notion that executive function is a set of higher order thinking skills, either way, we're talking about in both situations, there's values judgments involved. So, for example, if we're talking about things like the ability to prioritize, the ability to stay focused, the ability to not be impulsive, which are often considered, executive functioning skills, even in just the sort of skills-based way that we think about it, there's very much values attached to those. So, for example, when we say that, like, a kid in a classroom isn't able to prioritize, what we usually mean is that they're not willing to do what the teacher says when the teacher says it. And that may or may not be a skill that kid needs to survive in the world, but it seems to me unquestionably a skill that involves a value judgment, right? Like when you say you should prioritize X over Y, what we're saying is that X is more valuable than Y. And many neurodivergent people have no trouble at all prioritizing. We just prioritize the quote unquote wrong things, right? So there's value judgments involved in that discrete set of skills, for sure. But also even in this notion that executive functioning is higher order thinking. I mean, that in and of itself is very much a value judgment. So getting back to that kid in the classroom, right? So like there's a kid in the classroom who's playing Legos and building something really cool, right? And learning all kinds of cool things about mechanics and construction and design while they're doing that. And the teacher comes over and says, hey, it's time to put your Legos away. And now we're going to go sit quietly at our seats and do this math worksheet. And the teacher says, and the kid says, I don't want to. And the teacher says, you have to. And the kid says, why? And the teacher says, because I said so. And when the kid causes a disruption because they don't want to move from their Legos to the math worksheet, we call that executive dysfunction, right? We call that a developmental disability. This kid is not developmentally advanced enough in their ability, their higher order thinking skills to know that they need to move from the Legos to the seat work. Whereas from my perspective, quite honestly, that kid is doing critical theory, like in real time. That kid is doing like a critical theory takedown of the entire educational industrial complex, in my mind. So it sort of depends on like what your values are, right? How you see this as higher order thinking. I just think the notion that executive function is higher order thinking, or at least the only sort of higher order thinking that is possible or that matters, is just complete bunk. And in the previous live stream that I did, I offered a whole other set of skills and values, which I call design thinking, which I think are a set of skills and values that are much more meaningful and in keeping with the natural talents that neurodivergent people often have. And if we lived in a world where those were the sets of skills and the values that our society overall embraced, then we wouldn't really have much of a problem, right? We wouldn't be considered developmentally delayed. We wouldn't be considered even disabled, right? But that's not the world that we live in. So anyway, I hope that I have debunked this notion that executive function is the only sort of higher order thinking that is possible or that exists in the world, and that we as neurodivergent people are just like lacking it or somehow delayed in our development of it. And I'm not sure if anybody's still here watching, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the comments, in the chat. I'd be happy to, before I have more that I want to talk about as I move on, but I want to make sure that if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts, that you have a chance to share those. Spiral Nerd says, hey, excited to hear your thoughts on this while I try to tackle cleaning my very gross kitchen. Yeah, so actually, that kind of leads me to the second half of this, because the fact that you have a gross kitchen, and my kitchen happens to be clean right now, but that's kind of an accident. I often have a gross kitchen is not a sign at all of, of a lack of higher order thinking, obviously. I mean, it just seems to me that it should go without saying, we have all these stereotypes for usually white normative men, like the absent-minded professor and the sort of distracted genius, the Einstein kind of persona. We accommodate that fact, like the fact that Einstein's desk was a complete disaster area. And if you look at the studios of lots of really famous artists, they're just completely trashed. And we somehow accommodate that. Like, we never accuse them of lacking higher order thinking skills. We just recognize that they're messy and disorganized. But we aren't willing to extend that, or I don't mean we. By we, I mean like the mainstream educational industry, the mainstream ADHD industry, autism industry, all of those industries that supposedly serve us are very rarely willing to extend to us the sort of accommodation or nudge, nudge, wink, wink that we do to those famous men like Einstein. And I can't remember, I once took a look I was looking at artist studios online, and some of them were just amazed. Like, I was just amazed that these really famous artists could accomplish anything in such messes. Even me, who often lives in quite a mess. So anyway, let's put aside this sort of absurd notion that executive function is a set of higher order thinking skills that neurodivergent people specifically lack. And move on to the ways that those discrete sort of sub-skills, like remembering where you put your keys and remembering to show up on time for appointments, and indeed our messy houses and gross kitchens. Let's talk about those as a set of skills that we are admittedly not great at, and that are, in fact, disabling in this society. I just want to quickly look at a comment that popped up from Marta Bratek. Hi, Marta. Another Marta. Nice to see you. Marta says, I can put this on the screen. How the order of destroying a planet because of incorrect design and rush in production and incorrect priorities in the word so far is not called a disability. Absolutely. I mean, I think about this all the time. Um, and Marta continues, I would like to see day-to-day people who create the labels of ADHD and autism, neuroexecutive skills, etc. Yeah, I would too. But I love your first point. I often like to say, like, if executive functioning skills are so higher order, like, how's that working out for us? Like, look at the state of the world. Look at the state of the planet. It seems like maybe that's not necessarily the highest order of thinking. Um, uh, I'm going to put up Lynette's comment. One of my granddaughters, the kid you described playing Legos, she has a tough time doing the sitting, structured, busy work stuff. She wants to interact and talk, touch, explore her environment. Absolutely, Lynette. Absolutely. And what I question is why have we decided that that's a problem? And what it seems to me that the kids like your granddaughter or the hypothetical kid that I was describing playing Legos, I mean, that was basically my son who I was describing, who's like, this is stupid when it's time to move on to the seat work, right? And gets labeled as, you know, uh, what are those words, those awful words that they use? Oppositional and defiant. And especially in the case of my son, who is Black, like that especially gets lumped on to people who are multiply marginalized, especially Black and people of color, other people of color. Those labels get lumped onto them in really dangerous ways. But yes, it seems to me that those kids are doing something right. Like that is a like why don't we consider the kid who sits compliantly at their seat and does the work just because the teacher told them so, even if they don't understand why and it's completely meaningless and it bores them to tears? Why isn't that a lack of higher order thinking skills? Um, and I have an answer to that. That's actually not just a rhetorical question because the answer is very political, right? Like the answer is that executive function, the set of skills that we call executive function, the way of thinking, the way of like marching in lockstep to a goal of independence and productivity and efficiency and compliance, um, is very useful in a capitalist society, in an industrial capitalist society, in a white supremacist, settler, colonialist, heteropatriarchal, cisgender, like all of those things, all of those systems of oppression really rely on efficiency, productivity, compliance. And so, of course, the people like Russell Barkley, who is very politically invested in those structures, um, of course, they're going to label the set of skills that makes us able to function well within those structures. They're going to label them higher order thinking. It's very much to the advantage of the system to put those sets of skills up on a pedestal and to call any other set of skills, such as design thinking, innovation, creativity, as disruptive, because they are disruptive. Like within school, as that institution exists right now, for the most part, with a very few exceptions, original thinking, innovation, creativity, design, it's all extremely disruptive to the ways that we do school, to the ways that school is structured today. So I I mean, I can get on my high horse about that forever. Like I've often quipped that executive functioning is really a set of capitalist values masquerading as skills. And for the most part, I think that that's true. For the most part, I think the things that we call, I'm just going to flip back to my notes because I had already flipped ahead, like the ability to prioritize. I've already talked about that as a very value laden skill. Um, the ability to stay focused and not get distracted, that is also an extremely value laden skill. It depends on um, what the object of our focus should be, right? Like if the if the object of our focus is the math worksheet, then our ability to stay focused on that is the skill. But if if the object of our focus is a problem that needs to be solved, then our ability to be flexible and get distracted by alternate possible solutions and ways of thinking and completely innovative, lines of inquiry, then that's the skill, right? So even things like focus and distractibility are extremely value laden. Similarly, impulsivity, like a lot of creativity and spontaneity and divergent thinking is often seen as impulsive, whereas in a different paradigm, in a design paradigm, um, those are actually the skills that other design paradigm requires, which is why we're so good as designers and creatives. Most of us. I don't mean to speak with a completely broad brush, but on the whole, I would say that neurodivergent people are better designers than we are executives. Um, Absolutely. Yeah, Lynette says. Exactly. She's so creative and thoughtful, but gets labeled as disruptive and disobedient. Um, and that, I mean, that's to me is just heartbreaking. I've seen that with my own son. I've seen that with so many of the neurodivergent people that I work with. Um, and that actually brings me to another one of my pet topics, which is shame. And by shame, I mean trauma. Because, I hate to say this, Lynette, but what's happening to your granddaughter in that classroom, I don't know how old your granddaughter is, but it sounds like she's pretty young, and already she's getting labeled as disruptive and disobedient for being who she is, for being the exuberant, thoughtful, creative person. And the accumulation of those labels and the reactions to them, to our ways of being, just causes tremendous shame and trauma over a lifetime. And that shaming usually starts pretty early, even in our families, even among the most well-meaning, often neurodivergent parents ourselves. We end up, labeling the kid who doesn't sleep through the night as the troublemaker. We end up labeling the kid who doesn't want to be put down and instead wants to be held to help with like nervous system regulation as manipulative. Like, it's so ubiquitous in our society. It starts so young, and the shame accumulates. And I really believe that it becomes trauma. It becomes a kind of complex trauma that we get trapped inside of. Um, and I think that, like, to the extent that we're not good at these these discrete executive functioning skills, the fact that we get shamed for not being good at them only exacerbates how bad we are at them. So to the point where I think that I have sort of moved on to my next set of notes, to the point where it's hard to know actually um, which of those sort of deficits, the executive dysfunctions or executive deficits, um, are on account of our neurodivergence, and which of them are on account of the shame and trauma of just being different in a neurotypical world. And more, I really am coming to believe that once you heal the shame and trauma, so many of the deficits not necessarily disappear, but get so much easier to deal with. I mean, that has just been my own personal experience in about 5 years, I guess, of doing this work for myself and with other people. That healing from the shame and the trauma goes a long way, goes way more than any of those like ADHD hacks or apps that the ADHD industrial complex is so willing to sell you, or even the coaches, the well-meaning coaches. There are great coaches out there, don't get me wrong, but there are also some really awful ones who will basically just pile on more shame and more trauma by giving you these solutions that were invented by neurotypical people that don't understand how we see the world, and then ultimately fail and then become yet another reason to feel ashamed and traumatized. But I do actually believe that even once you take off the shame, even once you heal the trauma, there still is a discrete set of skills that we're just not very good at. Um, you know, like I'm still constantly, I wear two different sets of glasses. This is my regular set of glasses, and this is my computer set of glasses. But I also use these for reading sometimes, because sometimes if I hold the book at exactly the right place, they're the perfect ones. And I'm still trying to figure out how to get all of my vision needs in one set of glasses. But right now I have two. And so I'm constantly putting a set of glasses down and not knowing where it is when I need it. Um, and it's enormously frustrating. Same with my phone. I'm constantly putting my phone down and I can't find it. And since I basically do my work on my phone, that's a problem. I've gotten much better at scheduling and my calendar and showing up to appointments on time. But like when I have a week, like this week has actually been a pretty crap week for me. Just like a lot of emotional labor in my family going on right now, a lot of support needs, and I'm pretty low spoons. And I'm already noticing like I'm not keeping on track of things the way that I have come to expect myself to be able to. So there is absolutely a discrete set of skills that let's call them executive functioning skills. Um, Even though we, I hope, have completely debunked the notion that they accumulate into higher order thinking. They are actually a set of sort of day-to-day skills that when you lack them, it can be really frustrating and disruptive and yes, disabling. Um, so, and so, yes, I want to talk about how, sorry, I get distracted when this is like another example, right? Like I'm not good at multitasking. When another comment pops up, I glance at it, I notice it, and then I think, oh, where was I? So actually, why don't I just go to the comment and then get back to my train of thought in a second. This comment, the shame and trauma aspect is really interesting. It feels connected to the wall of awful that I learned about from How to ADHD, where the wall is often made up of shame. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that wall of awful video, and I think that that is one of her best, honestly. I mean, there are a lot of places where Jessica and I diverge quite dramatically in how we think about neurodivergence. We diverge on our thinking about neurodivergence. But I think that that wall of awful gets at it really accurately. I'm just a big believer that you can't really know what you're capable of until you can disrupt the shame. I guess maybe the biggest difference between me and Jessica McCabe from How to ADHD is that I see that wall of awful as highly political. I see it as a wall that has been constructed in the service of white supremacist capitalism. And I'm not sure that Jessica does. I haven't watched her channel for a long time, so I can't really say. Um, but I guess that would be the difference between me and a lot of other people in the industry, in the sort of neurodivergent space, as we say. Um, but yes, absolutely, shame and trauma is huge, and I think it's just, if there's anything that you can do, um, if there's any one thing that I would recommend that you do to try to make your life better, it would be, I guess it's two parts. The one thing is two parts. A, believe that that difference is not disorder. Believe that you have a different operating system in your neurodivergence, but that there's nothing intrinsically pathological about it. And then B, start the process of healing, of disrupting the shame and healing the trauma, which is a lifetime of work, especially if that shame and trauma has been accumulated over a lifetime. But I think that if you want, like, forget about the apps, forget about the hacks, forget about getting a new and better calendaring system or a new and better like alarm setting system or whatever. Like, first believe that you are not disordered, and start the process of healing. Find a really good somatic therapist, find a community of peer support. Keep coming back to Divergent Design Studios because that's what we're all about here. And over time, I wish that there were quick fixes. Like, there's a million people out there who will sell you a quick fix. Coaches, institutes, books, podcasts, apps. Like, there's a million quick fixes. I don't believe in any of them. The only way that, as they say, the only way is through, and it takes time. It's a lifetime of shame and a lifetime of trauma that accumulates, and it takes time to overcome that, to heal that, to move through it. And I say that it's a practice, not a destination. Like, there isn't really necessarily an end, but it gets easier, it gets better. And I guess that's sort of where I was headed in this discussion about executive dysfunction as a disability. Definitely healing is like is the top solution, to the extent that there's a solution. That my top recommendation is that you attend to your own healing, even above like your work in the world, because your work in the world will get so much easier the more you heal. Like, if what you worry about is, oh, I don't have time to do all that healing stuff because I have too much important work in the world, climate change and racism and mutual, I need to be participating in mutual, all the rest of it. Like, if you want to do important things in the world, if you want to make a difference in the world, if you want to create art that changes people's lives, it's not even really a first and then thing, because I don't really believe in linear time, but like, healing has to be a big part of it. And you have to stop thinking that healing is like this selfish thing that you do for yourself, as opposed to all of the work that you do for the world, because it's a both and. It's absolutely both and. And I have in my notes that I wanted to talk a little bit about the social model of disability, and I've sort of been talking around it. But let me briefly explain what I mean by the social model of disability, and that will maybe bring this all full circle. So there's two ways, at least two ways, I'm sure there's many more, but there's at least two ways of thinking about disability. And one is that disabled people have something wrong with them, that the problem that causes their disability is intrinsic to their bodies and their minds, that it resides inside of them, and that the solution to the ways that problem with their body or mind affects their life is to cure them as much as possible, right? To fix them, to affect some change to their mind body so that they can act in the world in a non-disabled way. That's what we call the medical model of disability. The social model of disability suggests that there's all different ways of being in the world, that there is no such thing as normal that normal is a highly political, socially constructed concept, and that when a body or mind deviates, diverges from that so-called normal, and therefore isn't able to function in the world to full capacity, the problem is not the mind body. The problem is the society that has become so rigid in its concepts of what is normal that it isn't able to accommodate difference. And we sure live in that world, don't we? We sure live in a world in which difference is highly stigmatized, and what is normal is very specific, and very specific along the lines of really structural sorts of oppression. So whiteness is normal, blackness and brownness is deviant or divergent, able-bodiedness is normal, and any kind of body that isn't able to move, doesn't have the sorts of, I don't even have a really great language for this, because I mostly think in the sphere of sort of mental, neuro normativity. But certainly like executive functioning in the world in which we live almost everywhere, certainly in the Western world of, late capitalism, is executive functioning is normative. And so therefore, any sort of divergence from that is considered abnormal, disordered, deviant, pathological. But it doesn't have to be. Like we could imagine a world where there might be norms. I mean, society has to have norms and probably has to build itself around the abilities of sort of the majority of people, but that doesn't mean that that society can't also accommodate people who are different. And we see more and more of that in some small ways. The Americans with Disabilities Act now, requires that, that there be curb cuts for wheelchairs, and has all kinds of accessibility rules for buildings. We could live in a world that thought of neurodivergence in that way, and thought of the non-normative neurotypes that many of us have as not being disordered or pathological, but rather just needing accommodation. But we don't really. That's not the model that most people think about non-normative neurotypes. And so that is a big part of my work, is trying to shift that paradigm so that we start thinking of ourselves as, yes, disabled. We are disabled, but the disability doesn't necessarily reside in us. The disability resides in a political and socially constructed world that doesn't accommodate us. And so that's another solution. In addition to healing, and all of these things go hand in hand, but in addition to healing, seeking out accommodation, creating it for ourselves, designing lives that are accommodating for us. Like once you start to understand what it is you need to thrive in the world, it becomes at least possible to design a space and a work life and a family life that is built for how you function in the world. It's not always possible, and it's more difficult the more ways that you're marginalized, right? Like if you're poor, if you're a person of color, if you have other sorts of disabilities, um, if you're trans, if you're queer, like all of those multiple marginalizations add layers of difficulty to designing a life that is um, accommodating and healing for your neurodivergent mind. And I absolutely want to acknowledge that. But still, I think that for me, the concept that, oh, I can't really function in the workaday world of offices. I just can't. I like failed spectacularly for like 4 decades trying to and felt terrible shame about it. Um, oh, I could try to create some other kind of livelihood for myself that is more in keeping with how my mind works. Um, so anyway, I don't know if anybody has any more thoughts or comments. I have rambled on quite a bit here, but I guess that's sort of what a live cast is about, right? It's about me rambling on and on. I do soon, I hope, want to invite some guests onto the live cast so that it won't just be me endlessly talking, but that maybe I'll be in conversation with some other people um, who have thoughts that, you know, either coincide with my own, or even, I mean, I'm even open to, very open to being in conversation with people who have different ideas than mine. Um, so, yeah, so please feel free to add any more comments or questions or things that you'd like me to talk about in the chat. I know that there's a little bit of a lag, so I'm just going to like drink my water while maybe you do that. But yeah, if there aren't any, then I think my goal is always to finish under an hour, because I know that we don't have great attention spans for long things. And I find that when I look at a live stream on YouTube, even if it seems really interesting, if it's like over an hour long, I'm like, ugh, I don't know if that I have the time or the focus or the energy for that. Um, oh, it looks like somebody did have a comment and I missed it. Sorry about that. JD San, I don't know how you say that. I'm going to just put that up. I think of higher order as higher bar, as in requiring more dopamine, acetylene, etc., to executive functional functions. Have a theory that neurodivergent folks can't help but set their bar higher. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I do think that like there's so much that is all about sort of the social expectations, and I try not to speak with broad brushes about what neurodivergent people do or don't do. But yeah, I'd be very interested in hearing more about that. Um, as for the dopamine, acetylcholine, like again, that's really not my wheelhouse at all. Like I haven't really done that research, but people I know and trust are really sort of digging into all of these theories about neurodivergence. And the truth is that just as with executive function, they almost none of them really stand up when you really start digging very deep, um, or at least stuff that we think is settled science almost never is. It's almost always still very much at like the hypothesis stage, not even a theory. So the whole hypothesis about dopamine in the neurodivergent brain is very much that. But that's a whole separate thing. I would love to hear more about your theory about neurodivergent people and setting high bars. That certainly could be part of some of our issues. Um, but I still suspect that so much of it comes back to shame and trauma, that we set the bar so high, that we're such perfectionists, etc., etc. Spiral Nerd says, I know people often seem to have a sticking point around deconstructing EF of, but I can't even get myself to do the things I want to do. curious to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah, I get that pushback a lot. And again, I can't speak as a scientist. I can't speak like even as a theorist. Mostly I can speak from my own personal experience and the experience of people in my life and people that I've worked with. And I'm acutely aware that data is not the plural of anecdote, right? So that this is very much my own personal experience, and not, like I can't cite any double-blind placebo-controlled studies or anything like that, peer-reviewed, whatever. But my feeling is that shame and trauma, I mean, really, I can't even get myself to do the things I want to do. Like that's just like a classic trauma response, right? I don't know. Like in my own life, that is the story of the first, like if like the first decade of my life was pretty sweet and carefree and happy and creative, and then the next 40 years, the next 4 decades of my life was pretty much like me feeling like crap and not doing the things that I wanted to do and not following things through on the projects that I started, and getting mired in shame around that. And then the last half decade of my life has been understanding that dynamic, healing from shame and trauma. I would say that I am now able to do the things that I want to do, and I am able to follow through on the projects that I care about, or to let them go and not feel ashamed about them and not get mired down in them. So I can't, like, what I wish so much is that the sort of industries that, that we are the topic of, the research that we are the focus of, would stop looking at what's wrong with us inside our brain and stop trying to figure out how to fix us and cure us, and instead look at some of this stuff. Like, what is the effect of shame and trauma on us? Like, how much of our executive dysfunction is the result of complex trauma? I mean, it's no accident that if you look at a list of the symptoms, the quote unquote symptoms, dysfunctions of executive dysfunction, of ADHD, and if you look at a list of the symptoms of complex trauma, they're almost exactly the same. Like, this is when the light bulb went off in my head, was when I started following these complex trauma accounts on Instagram. And they were not neurodivergent people. They were not talking in a neurodivergent context at all. And they were putting these slides up of like the symptoms, the top symptoms of complex trauma. And I'd be like, oh, and look at this slide about the top symptoms of executive dysfunction. What are the chances that they are exactly the same? Like, what are the chances? So anyway, yeah. Sorry, I do get a little bit on my high horse about it. The hard thing about talking to people about these things is that, like, the last thing that I ever want to do is to pile on more shame, right? No, you're wrong. The problem is just that you're traumatized. Go get yourself healed. Pull yourself up from your bootstraps and heal your shame and trauma, and everything will be better. Like, that is the very last thing that I ever want to do. So it is a little bit hard to talk about these things in ways that don't just exacerbate the problem for lots of individual people. And that's why I always try to like couch everything in caveats and personal experience and like warmth and, like celebration and cheerfulness and cheerleading and all the rest of it. Because I think that too is also important. But I also believe that it's so important that we get these ideas out there, and especially this notion that shame is political. Because I really do think that this is a liberation movement that we're talking about, that neurodivergent people, I see such parallels between being queer and between being neurodivergent, and having come out as queer in about, what was it, like 1984? Like, the world has changed a whole lot. Like in 1984, queerness had been out of the DSM for like 10 years, right? Like when I came out as queer, 10 years before that, there was a code, there was a DSM code. um, and so, as far as we still have to go as queer people, things have gotten better. Like we at least no longer think of queerness as something that is diagnosable and requires a DSM code. And I really believe the same thing so much about neurodivergence. And people will say to me, oh, well, but being queer wasn't disabling. And I'm like, oh man, then you were obviously not queer in 1984. Because let me tell you all of the ways that being queer per the social model of disability was profoundly disabling. um, yeah. So 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 that's why on the one hand, I don't want to alienate or ever shame individuals, but on the other hand, I think it's so important for us to talk about these things, to talk about new paradigms, to try to like push ourselves and the community and the industries to a new paradigm. Um, I just want to come back to a couple of these comments. Moira says, I'm finding therapy really helpful in dealing with shame and healing and self-acceptance. I am so thrilled, Moira, that you have a good therapist. This is also, and that you're having that experience. That's just wonderful. And I hope that it keeps building and growing. That was my experience as well when I finally got a really, really good shrink. In my case, my therapist was a psychiatrist. Who really, like, together we basically saved my life and then kind of reconstructed me. Like, I went through a really traumatic divorce through which I was just completely like deconstructed and broken down. And together we sort of put me back together, and launched me into a whole different life. And I wish for everybody that they had access to that kind of care. Um, As with so many things, it's complicated though, isn't it? Because there are so many bad therapists out there who aren't doing good trauma-informed work. And in fact, before I finally arrived at my amazing shrink, I went through a whole series of therapists who ended up traumatizing me even more. So wonderful that you have found somebody who can work with you. But if you have been traumatized by a therapist, um, I'm sorry, first of all. I believe you, second of all. And I hope that you won't give up on finding help, even if it's not in the form of sort of classical psychotherapy, because I do think it's really hard to do this healing work all on our own. Take that down. And Marta says, Gabriel Mate, I think that's how you say his name, wrote and talked about childhood trauma. He has ADHD and his child as well, and talk openly how it evolved. I've heard so many people talk about him and his work, and I have to admit that I haven't investigated it yet. For a while, I was a little bit skeptical because it seemed to me that there was a tiny bit of a cult of personality around him and his work, and I'm always suspicious of cults of personality. But more and more, I'm realizing that he has some important things to say, and I probably do need to go and investigate his work more. I've been kind of moving away from trauma studies just because I feel so outside of my like any area of like credential or expertise, but more and more other people in my community, including Spiral Nerd there, um, who are doing work in trauma studies and like taking classes and reading books and educating themselves are convincing me that I don't need to be so afraid of um, overstepping, and that is probably a path that I need to like learn more about for sure. Um, Spiral Nerd, my good friend, says yes, finding an autistic therapist who's a trauma specialist has been such a game changer. We do so much unpacking internalized ableism, and it's so different and more helpful than any other therapy. Oh, it makes me so happy. 2 people right in a row telling me that they have found good therapists. That just like um, thrills me. And I hope that he never watches this live stream, but just between you and me and everybody else in the whole universe, including possibly my shrink, who may someday watch this, although I doubt it, I think he's autistic. I don't think that he's diagnosed, but he has such an autistic sensibility, certainly neurodivergent. Um, and I think that that was a big part of why we connected so well. Um, he was also just remarkable in other ways. I mean, we weren't technically doing trauma therapy. I mean, he was just a very classically trained Jungian therapist, kind of old school, but like he didn't believe in like CBT and like all the sort of latest fads. He really believed that you need to dig deep and like get at the real roots of problems. And so essentially what we were doing was like trauma informed therapy, even though he, even though that's not how he would have talked about it at all. But yeah, pretty sure that he is neurodivergent, um, and was so willing to accommodate me and my needs as a neurodivergent people. Again, without us ever talking about that, without that being the framing or the language that we spoke about, but like he understood that I needed to look at this stuff through a political lens. He understood that I needed, in order to be able to trust him, I needed to know where he was coming from politically. Um, and I don't think that that's stuff that he ever shares. Like he's got really clear and classical boundaries, therapist boundaries, you know, about what he talks about, what he doesn't talk about his own life. But I think that at some point he just realized that like if he was going to gain my trust and form a real therapeutic alliance with me, he was going to need to like open up a little bit more than he normally does, and he did. Like to his credit, he did. Marta says, "You give me hope. I will find a good therapist." Um, and thanks for talking about it. Yeah, I think that it's something that maybe we need to talk more about because I really did go through one, two, two really bad therapists. One who just like completely traumatized me. That was a couples therapist who was supposedly trying to save my marriage. But the marriage was the client, not me or my ex. Um, and he was also kind of a narcissist, truth be told, who was much more interested in um, how our relationship made him feel than in my work. So that was awful. And then I tried to find, like, then I went through 2 more therapists trying to find somebody to help me recover from him. And then finally, I went back to this shrink I had seen previously to prescribe medication and started seeing him as a therapist as well. And like that's a whole other story. I went into enormous amounts of debt to save my life. Like I just literally paid that off like last month. Not and like really not really, but like sort of. Anyway, long story. Um, I do think it's worth it. I don't think that a traditional psychotherapist is the only way to go. But if you are going to go down that route, you definitely want to find somebody who's trauma informed. Um, Probably somebody who has some sort of experience of marginalization and who is willing to look at um, our issues through a political lens. I just think that that's so important. Um, but um, I also think that community and peer support and mutual aid is really another sort of like if you know if there are like multiple foundations to our healing, that's an equally important one to classical psychotherapy, is finding people who are like you, finding a community where you're not a weirdo and a freak, or at least where being a weirdo and a freak is kind of celebrated and not stigmatized. Certainly where you're not shamed and where you're supported in disrupting shame. And again, that's like to toot my own horn here a little bit. That's precisely what Divergent Design Studios is all about. So now we are officially over an hour. So unless there are any other comments or questions, I think that I am going to say goodbye. As always, you can contact me at my here in the comments. I will read them all. You can also contact me at my my email, which is marta@martarose.com. Really easy to remember. Yeah, Moira says, I also had 4 unhelpful therapists before I found the right person. Yeah, you do have to be so persistent. It's such a shame that you do, but there you have it. If you're interested, I do have an online community called Divergent Design Studios. Right now, membership is closed until December, but if you'd like to be on the wait list or just on my email list in general, I will put a link in the description below, or you can go to my Instagram, which is Divergent Design Studios, and in the bio there, in the link in my bio, there is an option for getting on the wait list. That's a really nice community on the Mighty Networks platform. And again, membership will be open again in December, and that's $20 a month for basically everything. So yeah. So anyway, so glad to see some people, some new people, at least new to me. Although I'm never sure because I'm terrible with names and even with faces. So like, if you aren't new to me and I've been treating you like I don't know you, sorry. But I'm so glad you're here. I really appreciate your support. And I hope that I will see you next week. I have no idea yet what I'm going to talk about next week. If you have any thoughts, put them in the comments or shoot me an email or a DM on Instagram. And I would love to maybe address that in my next or a near live stream every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.